That's enough.
All right.
Go buy tickets.
Welcome to class. Before we turn the page on chapter 6, we're going to just kind of wrap that up. Press on into chapter 7 today. We have places to go, right? So we were talking last week about chapter 6 and this idea of trying to eliminate anxiety out of our lives. Understanding that our purpose is to seek first the kingdom and his righteousness, and worrying about all of these things that really have no, worrying has no impact on the outcome of these things. It's a fruitless endeavor. I just wanted to conclude the idea that we were working on last week, thinking about seeking first the kingdom and his righteousness and all of these things being added. In verse 31 of chapter 6, Jesus kind of concludes by saying, "Do not be anxious then, saying, what shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or with what shall we clothe ourselves?" The pronouns that he uses there again remind us that Jesus is talking about us in a community, and how important it is for us to realize that when he places us in this community, that is our safety net. That we are intimately involved with one another in this community, and that when we have needs, the community should be seeing to those needs. It's kind of a distant concept to us in many ways as we think about our own independence and our own sense of accomplishing these things on my own, and so those kinds of ideas don't come natural to us, I should say. But Jesus is placing us in this community, and that is providing that safety that should alleviate that anxiety. I think that we all have distance to travel to work on that concept of being that intimately involved with my community that I can eliminate the anxieties, understanding that safety net is built in to the plan of God. Anything that you have before we press on then into chapter 7? We're not exhausting these topics, I understand, but
just the last line in there, each day has enough trouble of its own.
right.
It's like when you put your head on the pillow, let it go.
Right. And that also reminds me, this is a response. If you're looking at these words of Jesus and think, well, he's just being Pollyanna, and that's not realistic. It's just a naive approach to life to think that you can live it without anxiety. No, Jesus isn't. He said, life is full of trouble. He's admitting it. He understands life is full of trouble. But just let each day take care of itself. And there's something about the trust that is required of the child putting it into the hands of their father that will really pay dividends in that regard. All right. Chapter 7. Are we changing subjects here? You read chapter 7 and these first several verses, and you might think that Matthew is just kind of has all of these leftover topics that he wants to throw in without them really having a great deal of commonality with what we've been talking about. So the last point that we've been talking about is our relationship to money and goods of the world. Now we are transitioning into the relationships we have with people again. Relationships with people and difficult relationships. It kind of harkens back to the things he was talking about with dealing with your enemies and how you're going to get through life with these things. But he begins with this topic, maybe one of the most often quoted parts of the Sermon on the Mount. Do not judge, lest you be judged. We like that one, Jesus. We like that one. Why? And I want to ask, we're going to try to talk about this. And I'm going to ask you to tell me what this means. Because commentators are all over the map with this. So I want you to kind of hone in on what it means to do not judge. So let's just read this in its entire context. Beginning verse 1. Do not judge, lest you be judged. For in the way you judge, you will be judged, and by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. And why do you look at the speck that's in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, and behold, the log is in your own eye, you hypocrite. First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. Do not give what is holy to dogs, and do not throw your pearls before swine, lest they trample them under their feet and turn and tear you to pieces. Ask, and it shall be given to you. Seek, and you shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds. To him who knocks it shall be opened. Or what man is there among you, when his son shall ask him for a loaf, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? If then, being evil, you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more shall your Father who is in heaven give what is good to those who ask him? Therefore, however you want people to treat you, so treat them. For this is the law and the prophets. So we're going to stop right there. He begins with, do not judge, lest you be judged, and ends with how you want to be treated, that's how you should treat others. Is there a connection between those two concepts? Of course there is. Of course there is. There's a bit of a conclusion that he's making there. But now the rest of this is just a hodgepodge of ideas that he is throwing together here. I'm going to try to show you that it is not at all a hodgepodge of ideas. And that there is a teaching pattern indeed being followed by Jesus that we've already seen. I'm going to take a look at that in just a moment. But before we do that, let's just kind of talk about this idea of judging. You tell me, what does Jesus mean when he says, do not judge? All right, let's before we get to that question, let's define judge. Well, let's just very generally, what's it mean to judge?
To assess.
To assess?
To assume.
To assume.
Sometimes to condemn.
To condemn. Sometimes this is a negative word, and sometimes it's not. I was on my way to the church building today, and I could have gone this route or I could have gone this route. I judged that this route would be a better choice. Sometimes it just means to make a decision. Sometimes it just means to evaluate. Sometimes it means to evaluate right and wrong. But sometimes it means to condemn. So is Jesus saying here, do not evaluate what's right and wrong? think it's fairly obvious that that cannot be what Jesus is saying. Because in just a few sentences, he's going to say this, beware of false prophets, verse 15. Who come in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. All right, we can inspect fruit. Right? We're going to have to make some conclusions based on that fruit that we're observing in the lives of people. Is that judging? Well, in a sense it is. Jesus, however, is saying, do not judge. All right? So tell me what Jesus means when he says, do not judge.
Don't be so quick
Don't be quick.
in making your judgment, particularly if you do it in advance of looking at yourself.
Okay. I
That's
like
probably
that.
more there than you wanted, but
No. Jeff, and then Chris.
I think this concept is about judging righteously, righteous judgments. When he goes on just a couple verses later and tells them, about looking at themselves first.
Mm-hmm.
When we look at the concept of righteous judgments, we look at concepts of, hypocrisy, being presumptuous, and he's being unmerciful when people deserve mercy. So all those concepts come into judging with righteous intent.
Okay.
God does that.
Chris?
Judging really, at the base, means comparing to a standard. My father used the example, he grew up on a farm, that there was a board that had different size holes in it, and they would grade eggs, or they would grade tomatoes, or whatever it was, by that standard. It wasn't subjective, well, this is medium, large, and extra large. He didn't make that decision, the board did. So we're comparing by a standard. We just have to be careful, according to a couple of verses here, that we don't set the standard or are the standard.
Jesus said, do not judge. Gintis and then Barney.
Well,
You
just
have
reading,
things to
just
say.
going on, what he does is, you're looking at something as somebody else where you're guilty of that thing even more. So you got this
Hypocritical
log.
judgment.
So you've got this log, but you're looking at other people first.
Jesus says, do not judge. That's what he said. That's what I'm asking. I'm not asking about the examples just yet. We're going to get there. Those, of course, do clue us
You
into
can't,
some
you
of
can't
these
just say
things.
you don't make any judgment.
You can't say that. But Jesus said
I'm
it.
trying to thread the
Jesus
needle
said
here.
it. All right, we're gonna get there, Bonnie.
I think that Jesus has just concluded a section where he is saying, don't put yourself in the place of God. You can't change anything about your life with worry. You can't take care of yourself.
That's a beautiful
But then he
thing.
moves on into saying, don't put yourself in the judgment seat. That's mine.
Beautiful. You're nodding. And was that your comment?
Well, yes, I was going to say the way I've applied this in my life is perception, perspective, and position. So to put myself in a position where I have the perspective of Jesus is the person trying, or God, is the person with a log in your eye.
Yeah. All right. I think we're making some progress here. Jenny, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I was just thinking about being judgmental,
Being
like it's an
judgmental.
attitude.
Okay.
Maybe it comes down to
Yes,
that.
Kelly.
There's also the iceberg effect. You see the image of somebody that they project, and you only know this much, but you don't see a person's motives or their history or why they have drawn to the conclusions that they're at. Whereas when you're looking at yourself, you have a full picture. And so to treat people, based upon this little, whether it's good or bad, I mean, look at the Pharisees. They were, putting out this image of being, just and holy, but they didn't have a right attitude.
Who has the whole picture? That's a good point. All right. So let me see if I can, just by illustrative purposes, make this clearer or more cloudy.
I vote for clear.
You would prefer me make this clear until I'm not, no promises. How about this? What is a judge?
Mosley.
Judge Mosley.
A
Okay.
decision maker.
So a decision maker. So I want you to just picture somebody in a black robe right now who's listening to sides in the justice system, the whole system of justice. And the judge does what? Well, he has to make some evaluations and then he has to make some decisions, but his job is not done, is it? He will have to pronounce either guilty or innocent. Juries do this, I understand too. Same thing. But think about the judge carries this question of justice all the way to its end point. So he pronounces sentence. Many times that's the responsibility of the judge to pronounce sentence, to condemn the criminal, right? And say, now you, because of what you have done and because we've evaluated this, here is justice coming at you now, and you are deserving of this treatment. That's what a judge does. He takes it all the way to the end point. Now, is that what Jesus is saying here? And in my mind, that's where I'm at right now. Jesus isn't saying don't evaluate good and bad. He's not saying don't make some decisions about what is best. And he's not saying that you don't look at people and identify that's good. But you are not responsible as the one who is carrying out the justice, pronouncing the sentence upon that person. And I don't know that that captures it completely yet. That's why I'm asking you the questions. What does Jesus mean here? But here's something that I do know. This is not the first time that Jesus has used a blanket statement that we've had to understand some nuance, right? From the previous topic, let's move forward here just a bit. From the previous topic, we find Jesus making a blanket prohibition. You remember that previous topic where we were talking about that? He said, don't store up treasures on earth. Seems to be a fairly straightforward command. Anybody here have a bank account? We all have bank accounts. We all plan for our financial future. We don't believe that Jesus literally means do not ever store up valuables. We don't believe that that is a blanket prohibition against providing for our futures, right? Well, and then in the telling of that, he talks about the lamp being, or the eye rather being the lamp of the body that's going to decide whether he's going to be generous or if he's going to be stingy. If the lamp is good or if the lamp is bad. It's a little parable that he tells, trying to bring light to this topic. And then he talks about two incompatible things. God and mammon. You have to make a choice. What's it going to be? God or wealth? And then he says, look at how God provides. Look at the birds, look at the flowers. Doesn't God care so much more about you? How much more will God provide for you? Now that's a pattern that we see Jesus repeating here in chapter 7. He makes this blanket statement, do not judge. And then he has this little parable about a guy with this log in his eye trying to help somebody out with a little speck of sawdust in his eye, to bring light to this topic. And then he talks about two incompatible things. Don't give what is holy to the dogs, and don't cast your pearls before swine. We'll talk a little bit more about that. What do dogs and pigs have to do with this? Well, he's just saying that there are some things that are incompatible here, and then he will conclude with this idea in chapter 7 and verse 11. If then you, being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more can God be the giver of good gifts? We find that pattern repeated. And I find that extremely interesting because you know I'm interested in the structure and in the patterns that emerge from the Sermon on the Mount. The literary design of this as Matthew, working under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, works these things out for us in such a marvelous way. So I'm telling you that these are not random ideas that he is throwing together. They are related to the same ideas that he has already presented. And not only are they related, they are coming in the same sequence of ideas. And so what is true about do not lay up treasures is also true about do not judge. It's quite interesting that this is how this all unfolds for us here. So, do not judge, and he concludes with the golden rule. Because nobody wants to be judged like that. In fact, that's a catchphrase now. Don't judge, right? You see me last week at the Austins. Did you see me get in line a second time to see what food I might get?
We were talking about that.
And I'm looking up my shoulder, don't judge, right? Because you might look at me and say, Bruce, you don't really need to get seconds. Don't judge. Because what you're saying when you're saying don't judge is you are making a comment about my motives, right? So my motive might have been, I'm going to go and see if there's some food here that I thought was particularly tasty that my wife might want to sample. Maybe that was my motive. Well, maybe it wasn't. But you don't know that, right? How can you come to this quick conclusion about what my motive is? I can sometimes, listen to me, discern my own motives. I can sometimes discern my own motives. And what I tend to do with myself is I give myself the benefit of any doubt I might have. I'm pretty generous with Bruce. He's a well-meaning guy. I'm pretty generous of spirit and gracious toward Bruce. But when it comes to extending that grace and that kindness to others and the benefit of the doubt, that sometimes is not my first impulse. How about you? Can anybody relate to what I'm saying? I'm willing to give myself the benefit of the doubt, but I find it much harder in doing that with somebody else. In church situations, spiritual families in particular, I think is what Jesus is talking about here in particular. Here we are in this community. We're each other's safety net. We're each other's, co-bonded person to Christ. And yet we understand there's this high standard of righteousness that Jesus is talking about here, and I don't see you living up to it. And if I'm real honest, I don't see myself living up to all of it. But it's much easier to see other people. Why is that? Why is that? Why is it my first impulse to judge others as falling short? Yeah, Jeff.
I think for me, it's because I've seen people make those mistakes and then they get up and they speak about something and say, we shouldn't do that, and they've done it themselves before. And so we've seen people,
Live inconsistently?
right, we've seen the inconsistency.
Not me,
and,
right?
You know, and then we get jaded, let's just be honest. We get, you know, we're like, well, here you are saying this, but I've seen you make that mistake before and not do that to others. And why am I going to trust you the second time when you haven't done it the first time? And so it's really hard
It's hard.
be extra forgiving and extra merciful when you've seen it not be held up.
Jesus is challenging us quite significantly in this text, I believe. Yes, Gentis.
I notice it's a chance for me to maybe show off a little righteousness when I get to
I'll compare it.
point it out just
Yeah.
on somebody else, where if I had pointed out about myself, that's hard. Because you have to be open and humble.
Amen.
I think I'm better than everybody else. That's why I do it.
I think you are too, Ben.
Yeah. I got my load.
Great.
I didn't want to come at it from that angle. It was pretty self-deprecating. You picked up on that. Pretty honest.
I did, Ben, but I couldn't resist.
Me too.
But we somehow, in religious circles, we teach each other to be judgy.
It's defensive sometimes.
It becomes our initial impulse. Maybe, I don't know that we're born with this, but something about the culture that I've lived in all of my life makes me have this bent that is my first impulse, is to judge. We put a lot of emphasis on doing the right thing and teaching the right thing and opening up the Bible to get the right answers. And so it's easy to look around and say, oh, people aren't living up to that standard. And that becomes the first impulse. And what Jesus is saying is, don't let that be your first impulse. Exercise some discipline to understand it. If you aren't even sure about your own motives, how in this world can you speak to the motives of somebody else? How can you do that? And so it's sometimes hard to be gracious and humble and giving space to that other person. But it's a command. Do not judge. I'm not sure I understand everything that Jesus means when he says do not judge, but it means something. It means something, and it's a real challenge of his disciples to really have that kind of discipline. For in the way that you judge, you will be judged. I think that's, again, foreshadowing the golden rule. And by your standard of measure, it will be measured to you. Yeah, Mike.
Is this word judged meaning bringing condemnation? Or is it judge, they may or may not be guilty, or are we bringing condemnation?
I think a judge goes all the way. A judge sees the process all the way to the end to pronounce condemnation, or what's the other option?
Vindication.
Vindication, that's the word. A judge takes that all the way to the end. And I think part of what Jesus is saying here, you can evaluate whether somebody has done something right or wrong, and you can even identify it as wrong. Are you ready to pronounce judgment now upon them? Are you ready to condemn them? Let me just say one thing, and then I'm going to let Ben clarify all of this for you.
Good choice.
There is in the life or in the action of a judge, there's no room for redemption. There's no opportunity for redemption. It's over. Justice is spoken, it is meted out, it is executed, and it's over. That's what a judge does. And so once that condemnation is stated, well, what? There's no role for another judge. You know what I'm saying? You trying to get in God's position here? You trying to be God? You trying to pronounce judgment,
Because if you replace
condemnation
if you
upon
replace
somebody?
judge, condemn not, that you be not condemned. If you just take that judge, the word judge.
Some people do interpret it that way, and I think that's pretty close.
Just being careful not to do that.
I think it's pretty close to Jesus' meaning. But Ben's going to clarify it all for us right now.
I usually clarify things with a question, so don't get your hopes up. If we're allowed to judge, but we must look at ourselves first, if we're allowed to judge at all. I look up there in each one of those situations. I mean, just the first one, do not store up treasures on earth. A serious evaluation on that brings in nuance. It brings in financial stewardship. It involves, when you're looking at yourself, I don't know if I ever get the answer for Ben, much less get the answer for Bruce. So you have to be extremely cautious and careful. If you qualify by looking at yourself first, and then you've got to have the love as you evaluate fruits that are being born in others, to the extent you love them so much and you get to a place where you think their soul is at stake. They need to be brought to what you think is the understanding of what righteousness looks like. Bonnie and I we've been talking about this a lot lately, about just walking around with our judge hats on, because we're so high and mighty, of course. But I don't know, I would like to know how you get to the place when you can justifiably speak to one because their soul salvation is coming into play, and if you wait to speak, it's too late. So in terms of applying all of this in certain situations, I want to make sure that I tend to that too. Yeah. And I'm going to tend to it mercifully and lovingly and carefully, and make sure I've got a relationship with someone to do that, or else I'm going to find someone that's better suited for it. Or if it involves a judgment that I should not be making because those with a seasoned amount of wisdom like a church leader can do it, I go there too. That's way too wordy, I know, but that's what's on my mind as I look at that chart and I look at Ben.
Yeah, so there is there's a lot more to talk about.
Well, I know.
We haven't even
We
gotten
don't
to
even know.
the next parable, but you all have things to say, so I want you to say.
Well, when I read this and I think about this statement that Jesus makes about not judging, and then just perceiving what people's actions are, I think the way I process that for myself is it creates a pattern for the way I behave towards others. So when I see somebody in a sin, whether it's something that is familiar to me or not familiar to me, the way I respond to that, this informs that. So I have to take what he says here and do not judge and have that turn upon me with what else he says at other places.
Yeah.
So when this person is doing something that may offend me, it may frighten me because it's unfamiliar. Maybe I grew up in a context where that behavior was openly condemned or in some cases mocked. It is challenging for me to see that filter through the way Jesus sees it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he's asking us to do, and to remember the other things that he's taught us about our relationship with other image bearers.
Yes.
And it is an equalizer, if that makes sense.
Let me just point you to one thing to consider before you finish class. John, the 8th chapter, the woman caught in adultery was brought to Jesus. And they said, shall we stone her? And Jesus said, well, first one without sin, cast the first stone. And they all left. And Jesus questioned to the woman, is there no one here to judge you? And I do not judge you either. But his concluding remark is, go and sin no more. He's making an evaluation that she was involved in sin. But he did not judge her. He just tells her to go and sin no more. Think about that and bring that to class next week as we talk some more.